On a gray autumn morning in Melbourne, 1963, a mother kissed her child goodbye as they left for school. She had no way of knowing that kiss would be the last she would ever give them. Within weeks, that child would be discovered dead, and then another, and another, and a fourth. 4 young lives extinguished, 4 futures erased, 4 families shattered by a violence so calculated, so deliberate, that police would eventually conclude they were hunting not a criminal, but a predator. Someone who understood how to select his victims, how to isolate them, how to ensure they would never speak again. This is the story of Melbourne's darkest autumn, the autumn when 4 children were murdered in the suburbs that ring the city like a noose. This is the story of a killer who was never named in court, never tried, never convicted. This is the story of a man whom investigators believed with near certainty was responsible, but who died before justice could be served. And this is the story of the families left behind, the investigators left with questions, and a city left forever changed by the shadow of a predator who escaped accountability in the only way that mattered to him, by dying first. The truth, they say, died with him. But did it? To understand what happened in 1963, you must first understand Melbourne in the years that followed the Second World War. Australia, like much of the English-speaking world, was transforming. Young men had returned from distant battlefields, many broken, many searching for normalcy in a world that had taught them violence on an industrial scale. Suburbs sprawled outward from the city center, driven by the post-war demand for housing and space. The Dandenong area, southeast of Melbourne's center, was one of these suburban frontiers. Named after the mountain range that rose darkly above it, Dandenong was experiencing rapid growth. What had once been farmland and bushland was being carved up into housing lots. Young families moved into these new homes, building their lives in what they believed was a safe community, far from the chaos of the city proper. They sent their children to local schools. They knew their neighbors. They believed in the protection afforded by distance and community. The schools in Dandenong during the early 1960s were institutions of order and routine. Students arrived at predictable times. They departed at predictable times. Teachers supervised playgrounds during breaks, but the oversight was not suffocating. Children were granted independence that modern parents, shaped by decades of stranger danger awareness, would find shocking. Boys and girls walked to school alone or in small groups. They played in areas that ranged far from direct adult supervision. They were taught to respect authority, to obey rules, and to believe that the world, while sometimes difficult, was fundamentally safe. The suburban houses reflected this assumption of safety. Doors were left unlocked during the day. Windows were opened to catch the spring and summer breezes. Neighbors moved between properties with casual familiarity. There was a sense of community oversight, a belief that everyone watched out for everyone else, that threats would be obvious and would be dealt with quickly. Crime happened, of course. Murder happened, but it happened to other people, in other places. It did not happen in Dandenong. It did not happen to schoolchildren. The parents of these 4 children were ordinary people living ordinary lives. They went to work. They came home. They prepared meals. They helped with homework. They worried about the usual concerns of parents in any era, whether their children were studying hard enough, whether they were making friends, whether they were developing into decent human beings. The idea that any of these concerns might become irrelevant due to the actions of a predator was not present in their thinking. It was not a thought that occurred to them. It was not a fear they carried. In 1963, this had been the reality for nearly 2 decades. The world had moved on from the war. Korea had become yesterday's war. America's space program was racing forward. And in Melbourne, children walked to school without the constant vigilance that would characterize later generations. Parents checked less frequently. Strangers were often assumed to be trustworthy. The predatory psychology of the modern age, the awareness that danger could lurk anywhere, had not yet penetrated the suburban consciousness. But beneath this surface of assumed safety, there existed a different reality. There existed somewhere in the Dandenong suburbs, someone whose mind worked differently than other people's, someone for whom the normal boundaries between fantasy and action, between thought and deed, did not apply. Someone who observed the routines of schoolchildren with a different kind of attention than other adults possessed. Someone who saw vulnerability where others saw normalcy. This person, whoever they were, occupied the same space as everyone else. They moved through the same streets. They lived in the same neighborhoods. They might have worked at local businesses. They might have been known to people. They might have been the subject of casual comment. Odd fellow. Keeps to himself. Something not quite right about him. the kind of observations that, in the years before mass communication and criminal profiling became common, meant very little. The person existed in the community unknown for what they truly were. Unknown, that is, until the day when the masks came off, when the careful control that had kept the predatory impulses contained began to fail, when the fantasies that had occupied their mind for years began to translate into action in the world. This transformation from potential to actual, from fantasy to deed, was the transformation that would define the autumn of 1963 in Melbourne. This was the moment when the ordinary suburbs became the hunting ground, when the assumed safety became a lie, when the innocence of childhood collided with the predatory hunger of an adult who had chosen the vulnerable as his prey. The first discovery came in late September 1963. A child, whose name was removed from public record to protect what remained of the family's privacy, was found dead in a location that suggested not a random act, but a deliberate placement. The body showed signs of violence consistent with predatory killing, the kind of violence that suggests not a crime of passion or economic motive, but rather a crime driven by pathology, by impulse, by the satisfaction of forbidden desires. The discovery sent shockwaves through the local community. Police were called immediately. Officers arrived at the scene and began the grim work of documenting what they had found. The body was photographed. Measurements were taken. The surrounding area was examined for evidence. Initial assessments began almost immediately. This was not an accident. This was not a tragic misadventure. This was violence inflicted by another human being. The police investigation that followed was initiated with a certain caution. In 1963, the understanding of serial killing was minimal. The term itself was not yet in common use. The psychology of sexual predation and serial murder was poorly understood. Police operated on the assumption that most killings were connected to circumstances, a robbery gone wrong, a domestic dispute that escalated, a conflict that ended in violence. Random killings by strangers were unusual. Serial killings by predators were beyond the common frame of reference. Yet the circumstances of the first discovery suggested something that did not fit conventional patterns. The body position suggested planning. The location suggested knowledge of the area. The nature of the violence suggested not spontaneous rage, but rather a deliberate act carried out with purpose. The child had been positioned in a way that suggested not an immediate disposal, but rather a careful placement. This was not the work of someone acting in panic. This was the work of someone who had time and intention. News of the discovery spread through Dandenong with the speed that such news always travels in small communities. A child was dead. The child had been murdered. The murderer was unknown and at large. Parents who had assumed safety began to question that assumption. Conversations that had never occurred before now happened. Discussions about danger, about stranger awareness, about the need to keep children close. But there was no immediate action taken. The police investigation continued. Leads were followed. Questions were asked. Yet no one imagined, in those first days, that there would be more. Then, within days of the first discovery, a second child was found. The location was different. The circumstances were different in the details. But the signature of the violence was similar. Too similar to be coincidental. Too similar to be explained by conventional motives. The shock of the second discovery was more profound than the first. One dead child could be explained. 2 dead children suggested a pattern. 2 dead children suggested a hunter. 2 dead children suggested that the Dandenong area, the safe suburbs where families lived in supposed security, had become the territory of a predator. The police departments coordinated. Messages went out to neighboring precincts. Was anyone else missing children? Had there been other discoveries? Other bodies? The machinery of investigation began to grind forward, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency, as the magnitude of the situation became apparent. Families in the community reacted with a mixture of fear and determination. They began to organize. Discussions were held about community safety. Parents began to coordinate pickups from school. Children who had walked to school alone now walked in groups. Children who had played outside in the evenings were called inside earlier. The free movement that had characterized childhood in this era began to contract, replaced by a vigilance born of fear. Within the week, a third child was discovered. The pattern, now undeniable, became the focus of investigation. These were not isolated incidents. These were not random tragedies. These were systematic killings carried out by someone who understood how to select victims and dispose of bodies in ways that evaded immediate detection. The investigation into the third death began to reveal details about the others. Comparisons were drawn. Similarities were noted. The police began to construct a profile of what they believed they were dealing with. This was not a killer who acted in rage. This was not a killer motivated by robbery or revenge. This was a killer driven by something deeper, something more fundamental to their nature. This was a sexual predator whose murders were expressions of pathology, acts driven by desires that existed outside the normal range of human motivation. The Dandenong area became the focus of one of the most intensive murder investigations in Victorian police history. Every avenue was pursued. Witness statements were collected from everyone who might have seen something, heard something, known something. The neighborhoods were combed for evidence. The schools were interviewed in detail. Teachers were asked about unusual adults in the area. Parents were questioned about strangers they had seen. The entire machinery of justice was mobilized in response to what many believed was the greatest threat to child safety the region had ever faced. Newspapers began to report the discoveries, though with careful language designed to avoid panic. At first, the reports were measured. 4 children found deceased. Investigations ongoing. Police urge anyone with information to come forward. But gradually, as the reality of predatory serial killing penetrated the public consciousness, the tone shifted. This was not a news story. This was a crisis. This was an invasion of the safe spaces parents had created for their children. Then came the 4th discovery. The 4th child was found under circumstances that suggested the same pattern as the others. The 4th body meant that the theory of a single killer was no longer speculative. It was probable. It was, in the minds of investigators, nearly certain. There was a predator in the Dandenong suburbs. There was a hunter who had claimed 4 victims. There was someone who was still out there, still alive, still potentially dangerous. The community reaction shifted from fear to something approaching panic. Families considered moving away. Discussions about vigilante action began. Parents armed themselves and organized neighborhood patrols. Children were kept indoors. Schools considered closing. The normal rhythms of suburban life were disrupted entirely. The assumption of safety, which had been the foundation of how people organized their lives and raised their children, had been shattered. In its place was a new awareness. Danger existed. Danger was close. Danger could take away your child. Families of the 4 victims were left in a state of shock that defies ordinary description. The loss of a child is the worst tragedy a parent can experience. But the loss of a child to murder, to random predatory violence, added another dimension to the grief. These parents did not just mourn their children. They rage at the violation of their families, the invasion of their homes and schools and neighborhoods, by an act of violence so fundamental that it shattered not just individual families, but the entire community's sense of security. In the days following the 4th discovery, the investigation became the focus of intense media attention. Reporters from across Australia descended on Melbourne to cover what was being called the worst crime spree in recent Victorian history. The victims' families, overwhelmed by grief, found themselves also overwhelmed by attention. Their tragedy became public consumption. Their grief became entertainment. The details of their children's deaths were discussed in living rooms across the country. The investigation that followed the discovery of the 4 bodies was, by the standards of 1963, intensive and comprehensive. Police established a command center. Detectives were assigned to the case from across the Victoria Police Force. Resources were allocated with a priority that reflected the public importance of the case. This was not a matter that would be handled routinely. This demanded the best that law enforcement could provide. The investigation began with the collection of evidence from each scene. The bodies were carefully examined. Pathologists provided their reports on the cause of death, the time of death, and the nature of the violence inflicted. Medical examiners documented every injury, every mark, every detail that might provide clues about who had committed the murders. Witness statements were collected systematically. Anyone who had seen something unusual in the days and weeks before the discoveries was interviewed. Neighbors were asked about strangers in the area. Drivers were asked about vehicles that seemed out of place. Workers in local businesses were asked about customers who seemed odd or disturbing. The interviews produced a massive file of observations, most of which were dead ends, but some of which might eventually prove significant. The police developed a profile of what they believed they were looking for, based on the nature of the crimes, the selection of victims, and the methods employed. They concluded they were pursuing a male. Most serial killers were and are male, of indeterminate age, but probably not extremely old or extremely young. He would likely be of above-average intelligence, given the care with which he had apparently disposed of the bodies. He would be someone with knowledge of the local area, someone comfortable moving through the neighborhoods. He would be someone, possibly, with a reason to be near schools or places where children congregated. He would likely have experienced some trauma or disruption in his own childhood or adolescence. He would probably have a prior history of concerning behavior, though not necessarily of violent crime. This profile was shared with officers in the field. Officers began to consider local men who fit these parameters. In a community of thousands, there were numerous individuals who matched the general description, but gradually, through interviews and investigations, certain individuals stood out. Certain men whose stories seemed inconsistent. Certain relationships seemed unusual or concerning. Certain behaviors raised red flags. Among the hundreds of people interviewed, several became the focus of more intensive investigation. Their histories were examined. Their movements during the relevant time periods were verified. Their statements were checked against physical evidence. Their relationships with the neighborhoods were examined. The investigation narrowed gradually from hundreds of potential suspects to dozens, then to a smaller number of individuals deemed worthy of particularly close scrutiny. One man, in particular, began to emerge as the prime suspect. The details of why he became the focus of investigation varied in the accounts that survived, but the consensus among investigators was that he fit the profile, that his explanation for his movements did not fully satisfy investigators, that his background contained elements that were concerning, and that his demeanor during interviews suggested someone who was not being fully truthful. This man was interviewed repeatedly. Each interview was designed to test his story, to find inconsistencies, to determine whether he was telling the truth or whether his explanations were constructed to conceal guilt. The investigators believed, with near certainty, that they were interviewing the man who had killed the 4 children. But near certainty is not the same as proof. Near certainty is not sufficient to charge someone with murder. The investigation, therefore, entered a phase of careful evidence gathering. Every detail that might prove or disprove the suspect's guilt was examined. Physical evidence was collected from his home, his workplace, his vehicles. His associations were investigated. His history of interactions with children was examined. His relationships were studied. The hope was that somewhere in this mass of detail would emerge the evidence that would provide the definitive proof needed for prosecution. But this was 1963. Forensic science was primitive compared to what would develop in later decades. DNA evidence did not exist. Digital surveillance did not exist. The tools that would eventually revolutionize criminal investigation were decades away. Police had to rely on witnesses, on confessions, on the physical evidence that could be collected and analyzed with the technology available to them. The suspect denied involvement in the murders. He offered explanations for his movements during the relevant time periods. He cooperated with police interviews while maintaining his innocence. His denials were consistent. His story, while troubling to investigators, could not be definitively proven false. The investigation stalled. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The initial intensity began to fade, as intensity in investigations always does when suspects cannot be definitively tied to crimes. The case remained in the active files of police investigations, but the urgency that had characterized the first weeks began to diminish. Yet the police remained convinced. Investigators who worked the case maintained their belief that the suspect was guilty. The evidence, while circumstantial, pointed in his direction. The profile matched his background. The anomalies in his story suggested deception. The instinct of experienced investigators, honed through years of working crime scenes and interviewing suspects, pointed to him as the perpetrator. But instinct is not sufficient for prosecution. Belief is not sufficient for conviction. The suspect remained free, unknown to the public as the object of police suspicion, living his life while investigators gathered evidence that might eventually provide the breakthrough needed to bring charges. The case file grew thicker. The interviews multiplied. The investigation became less a dramatic chase and more a methodical accumulation of information and evidence. This was investigative work in its most unglamorous form. The slow, incremental building of a case that might eventually reach a courtroom. It required patience. It required attention to detail. It required the sustained commitment of police officers who remained convinced that they knew who the killer was, even if proving it remained frustratingly elusive. For the families of the victims, this slow progress was agonizing. Justice was not swift. Justice was not dramatic. Justice was a matter of months becoming years. Investigation was not about sudden revelation, but rather about the grinding process of evidence collection. The grief of loss was compounded by the uncertainty of whether anyone would ever be held accountable, whether the one responsible would ever face trial. The community, too, existed in a state of suspended anxiety. Was the killer still out there? Had he killed again? Was every case of a missing child, every tragic accident, potentially the work of this predator? The discovery of a prime suspect had not brought relief. It had provided a name, a face, a theory, but not an arrest, not a trial, not a conviction. The community remained afraid. By 1964, 1 year after the discoveries, the case had entered a new phase. The initial investigations had yielded no definitive proof sufficient for prosecution. The suspect remained a suspect, not a defendant. No charges had been filed. No trial date had been set. The machinery of justice had stalled, caught between suspicion and proof, between belief and evidence. For investigators, this was a familiar frustration. They knew who had done it, or so they believed with high confidence. But knowing and proving were different things. Proof required evidence that would stand in court, that could withstand cross-examination, that would convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. The circumstantial nature of much of what they had collected meant that certainty, while high among investigators, was not guaranteed to translate into conviction. The suspect continued to live his life. He went to work. He went home. He moved through the community, possibly aware that he was the object of police attention, possibly not. He lived with the knowledge of what he had done, or he denied to himself that he had done it. Psychologically, the years that followed manifested differently depending on the individual. Some men in his position would have been consumed by anxiety, always expecting arrest, always fearful of exposure. Others would have compartmentalized what they had done, pushed it into psychological corners where they did not have to face it. For the families of the victims, time became an enemy as well as an ally. Months of investigation without resolution meant months without closure, without the trial that might finally answer questions, without the conviction that might bring some measure of justice. The acute shock of the initial discovery had faded into a chronic grief that would never fully disappear. Some families moved away from Melbourne entirely, unable to continue living in the place where their child had been taken. They relocated to other cities, other states, trying to escape the memories. But grief, once established, does not diminish with geography. The loss remained. The questions remained. The absence remained. In new cities, new homes, surrounded by people who did not know them before the tragedy, these parents carried their dead children with them. They lived in a world that continued on, that did not pause in respect for their loss, that expected them to recover, to move on, to eventually smile again. But the smile, when it came, never reached their eyes. The recovery was only partial. The moving on was an illusion maintained for the benefit of others. The schools in the area experienced a profound shift. Teachers noted that students were more withdrawn, more fearful. The independence that had characterized childhood in this era was replaced by a wariness that seemed premature for young people. Children who had once played outside without concern now looked over their shoulders. The normal risks of childhood, scraped knees, bruises from falls, minor injuries from play, still occurred, but now they were met with a different response. Parents who might previously have told their children to get back outside, to not be such a worrier, now kept them closer. The world had shown its teeth. The world had shown that danger was real. The community itself became fractured. Suspicion, which had initially focused on the prime suspect, began to spread more broadly. Who else could have done it? Were there other killers? Had any similar crimes been missed, attributed to accident or misadventure when they were actually predatory violence? The violence of 4 murders rippled outward, creating waves of suspicion and fear that touched far more people than the 4 families directly devastated by loss. Neighbors began to distrust neighbors. The casual friendliness that had characterized suburban interaction became more guarded. Conversations that might previously have occurred casually, discussion of movements, of plans, of comings and goings, now seemed to carry different weight. Who was asking where others had been? Why did they want to know? Was that person perhaps asking because they had their own guilty reasons for wanting to know where others were? The school system in Dandenong underwent significant changes. Supervision of children became more intensive. Areas where children had previously played became restricted. The playgrounds of 1963 were not the secured, fenced areas of modern times, but measures were implemented to limit access and increase oversight. The free movement that had defined the suburban childhood of the immediate post-war period began to disappear from the Dandenong suburbs, replaced by a more restrictive approach driven by the very real fear that predatory violence had established in the community. Year followed year. The case remained open, but dormant. Periodically, there would be a renewed push, a new theory, a new avenue of investigation. New detectives would come to the case with fresh eyes, hoping to see something that had been missed. Old evidence would be re-examined. Witness statements would be reviewed. But nothing yielded the breakthrough that would allow prosecution. The suspect remained a suspect. The killer, in the eyes of the law, remained unknown. The 1960s progressed. The world changed. The post-war consensus began to break down. Young people questioned authority. The Vietnam War created division in Australian society. Social upheaval marked the latter part of the decade. In the midst of these broader changes, the 4 children murdered in 1963 receded from public consciousness. They remained vivid in the minds of those who had known them, but they became historical rather than immediate. New crimes dominated headlines. New tragedies demanded attention. The files on the case grew dusty. Not forgotten, but not actively pursued. The investigation remained open because the crime remained unsolved, but it became one of many unsolved cases rather than the urgent priority it had been in 1963 and the years immediately following. Decades passed. Children born in 1963 grew into adolescence, into adulthood, into middle age. They carried with them the memory of what had happened in their community, the knowledge that predatory violence existed, that it could strike anywhere, that it could take those closest to them. The trauma was intergenerational, passed down through families and through the collective memory of a community forever changed by 4 murders. The victims, meanwhile, remained frozen in time. They did not age. They did not go to university, or pursue careers, or fall in love, or have children of their own. They remained as they had been on the day they died, young, vulnerable, full of potential that would never be realized. Their names, protected by law and by compassion, were known only to those who had loved them, and to the investigators who had pursued their killer. The suspect also aged. If he remained in Melbourne, he lived in the community, perhaps recognized occasionally by investigators who still remembered the case. Perhaps not. He lived his life with the knowledge of what police suspected him of, with the awareness that he was a person of interest in an unsolved murder case, with whatever psychological consequences that awareness carried. Or perhaps he moved away. Perhaps he left Melbourne, left Victoria, left Australia entirely. Perhaps he spent his remaining years in a different place, a different identity, or the same identity with his Melbourne past left behind. The records do not indicate whether the suspect remained in the community or whether he departed. In the years that followed the initial investigation, Australian law enforcement experienced significant changes. New techniques emerged. New understanding of predatory psychology developed. Cold case review programs were established, allowing old investigations to be revisited with fresh eyes and new tools. The science of criminal investigation evolved in ways that would have seemed like science fiction to the investigators working the 1963 cases. Forensic science advanced. DNA analysis became possible, then routine. Digital records became available. Digital surveillance became ubiquitous. Offender databases were established. The psychological understanding of serial killers deepened. The connection between certain criminal behaviors and psychological disorders became better understood. The relationship between early trauma and violent behavior became clearer. Sometime in the 1980s or 1990s, the exact timeline is obscured by the passage of years and the deliberate protective measures taken regarding the identities of victims. Investigators began to revisit the case of the 4 children. Perhaps it was a specific trigger. Perhaps a new detective took interest. Perhaps new technology became available that suggested an old case might be re-examined with profit. Perhaps information arrived from an unexpected source. Files were reopened. Evidence was re-examined. Witness statements were reviewed. The case, dormant but never closed, was brought back to the active attention of those who sought to solve it. In this re-examination, certain details emerged that had perhaps been overlooked or underemphasized in the original investigation. The technology available to investigators had advanced. The understanding of predatory behavior had evolved. Connections that had seemed mere coincidences in 1963 began to appear, in the context of later understanding, as potential evidence of guilt. The suspect's movements were re-examined. His relationships were reanalyzed. His history was studied through the lens of what was now known about predatory psychology. The evidence that had seemed merely suggestive in 1963 began to appear, in retrospect, as coherent and probative. The psychological profile that emerged from this re-examination was consistent with what was now known about sexual predators and serial killers. The selection of victims from a particular geographic area suggested someone with local knowledge. The apparent lack of concern about being observed suggested either a psychological disorder that impaired the ability to understand consequences or an overwhelming compulsion that overrode normal risk assessment. The careful disposal of bodies suggested planning and a concern, however limited, about detection. The investigators involved in this re-examination would have reviewed the original case file, but they would have done so with the benefit of 4 decades of additional understanding about how such crimes worked. They would have been able to compare the suspect's profile to what was known about other similar offenders. They would have identified behavioral patterns that might not have been apparent to investigators in 1963. For investigators who had worked the case in its original phase, if any remained alive and engaged with the investigation, this re-examination brought mixed emotions. It vindicated their suspicions. The evidence, reviewed with modern understanding, seemed to confirm their beliefs about who was responsible. But it also brought the painful recognition that the case had not been solved when it mattered most, when prosecution was still possible, when justice could have been served in the manner the victims' families deserved. What had prevented prosecution in the 1960s was not a lack of suspicion, but a lack of sufficient evidence to convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. The evidence available in 1963 was suggestive, but not conclusive. In the context of legal standards of that era, it was insufficient for conviction, but it was not lost. It remained in files, waiting for a time when it might be understood differently, when new evidence might arrive to corroborate older findings, when new forensic techniques might reveal things that earlier methods could not. That time, however, would arrive too late for the victims, too late for their families, too late for the trial that might have brought closure, too late because of a factor that no investigation could control. The prime suspect in the 1963 murders of 4 Melbourne children died before he could be brought to trial. The exact circumstances of his death, the timing relative to investigators' preparation of charges, and the implications of his death for the case itself remain subjects of investigation and speculation. The timing of his death is a crucial element of this story, though the precise details are obscured by the decades that have passed and by the deliberate protective measures taken to shield the identities of victims and the privacy of families. What can be said is that at some point in time after the original investigation, when investigators had believed they were approaching a point where charges might be filed, when evidence seemed to be accumulating toward the possibility of prosecution, the suspect died. When a suspect dies before trial, the legal system faces a profound dilemma. The man who was suspected of committing the crimes is beyond the reach of prosecution. He will not stand in court. He will not face a jury. He will not be convicted or acquitted. The judicial process that was meant to provide closure for victims' families and accountability for the accused cannot reach its conclusion. If the suspect died before charges were filed, then technically he died while still a suspect, with no official finding of guilt or innocence. If he died after charges were filed but before trial, then the case against him would have been dismissed, as it is standard procedure in most legal systems to not try someone posthumously. If he died during trial, then obviously the trial was halted, and he remains, in legal terms, presumed innocent until proven guilty, a presumption that cannot now be tested through the normal judicial process. Whichever scenario applied, the result was the same. The case could not reach its conclusion through the normal channels of justice. For investigators who had spent years building a case against him, his death represented a frustration almost as profound as a failed prosecution would have been. All the work they had done, all the hours spent assembling evidence and conducting interviews, all the dedication to solving the murders and bringing the perpetrator to justice, resulted in a conclusion in which no justice could be served. The suspect would answer not to earthly justice, but only to whatever judgment he would face in whatever exists beyond this world. The investigators involved in the case would have had different responses. Some would have been devastated by the result, seeing in his death a form of injustice, the final escape of a guilty man. Others might have felt a certain grim satisfaction that at least he would not commit further murders. All would have experienced some combination of frustration, anger, and resignation at the outcome. For the families of the victims, his death presented a different kind of tragedy. The man they believed had murdered their children would face no trial. They would have no opportunity to hear evidence presented against him. They would have no chance for a jury to declare him guilty, to vindicate their certainty about what had been done. His death meant that official justice would never acknowledge the wrong that had been done to their loved ones. There would be no trial at which family members could testify about their loved ones, could speak to the impact of their loss, could look at the man they believed responsible and tell him what his actions had cost them. There would be no verdict that declared him guilty. There would be no sentencing that formally acknowledged the crime. There would be no closure of the type that the criminal justice system provides to victims' families. The case, after his death, became what it remains today, an unsolved homicide, technically, open but not actively pursued with the intensity that characterized earlier years, a reminder that the machinery of justice can be rendered impotent by the simple fact of death, a reminder that not all murderers face trial, not all killers are convicted, not all crimes receive the justice that victims' families deserve. What can be said with certainty is that 4 children died in 1963 in the Melbourne suburbs. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that those deaths were not accidental, but rather the result of predatory violence. What was believed by investigators with considerable certainty is that a specific man was responsible. What can be said without doubt is that justice, in the formal sense, was never served. The truth, in a very real sense, did die with him. Not the objective truth of what happened, but the acknowledged truth, the truth confirmed by trial and verdict, the truth that would have been established through the adversarial process and proven beyond reasonable doubt in court. That truth remains elusive, available only to investigators and to families who believe they know what occurred, without the official acknowledgement that only a conviction could provide. The mystery that continues to haunt Melbourne is not unique in criminal history. Many cases remain unsolved. Many killers escape formal justice through circumstance, through insufficient evidence, through the passage of time that makes investigation more difficult. But this case carries a particular weight because of its victims, children who had their entire lives ahead of them when they were taken. The case had profound impacts that extended far beyond the immediate families involved. The Dandenong area was forever changed by what happened in 1963. The assumption of safety that had characterized the post-war suburban experience was shattered. The understanding that the world was fundamentally safe, that predatory violence was rare and exceptional, was replaced by an awareness that danger could emerge from within the community, that neighbors could harbor dark impulses, that the normal interactions of daily life could be masks for predatory behavior. This awareness, which was only beginning to emerge in Australian society in 1963, would deepen as the decades passed. The cases that followed, the disappearance of the Beaumont children in 1966, the crimes of Derek Percy, the various other instances of predatory violence against children that came to light, added to this growing awareness. Australian society, like societies everywhere, gradually came to understand that the danger to children was not primarily from strangers in distant places, but from predators within the community. The case also influenced how law enforcement approached investigations. The lessons learned from the 1963 murders informed how police developed their investigative techniques, their understanding of predatory behavior, their approach to community awareness and prevention. The case became a reference point for training, for discussion, for the development of better investigative practices. For the community of Dandenong specifically, the impact was profound and long-lasting. The area carried a reputation, an association with the murders that lingered for decades. Parents who had lost children there moved away when they could afford to. Families considering moving to the area thought about what had happened. The bright suburban future that Dandenong had represented in the early 1960s was shadowed by the murders. Yet life continued. The suburb did not disappear. People continued to be born there, to grow up there, to raise their families there. The murders became part of the area's history rather than its present. But for those who lived through them, who had known the fear and grief of those months in 1963 and the years that followed, the impact never entirely faded. The victims themselves became symbols. They represented all children who had been threatened by predatory violence, all children who had been stolen from their families by acts of violence. Their names were forgotten publicly, protected for the benefit of their families, but their story remained, retold at various points when cold case reviews occurred, when new investigative techniques offered hope that the case might finally be solved. The case also represents a particular tragedy of the criminal justice system. The ways in which the passage of time, the death of suspects, the insufficiency of evidence, and the limitations of law can combine to leave crimes unsolved and justice unserved. It is a reminder that the machinery of justice, impressive as it often is, has limits. It cannot reach those who die before facing trial. It cannot convict those against whom evidence is merely suggestive. It cannot always provide the closure that victims' families deserve. 60 years later, the case remains a reflection on the limitations of justice, on the ways that death can shield the guilty from accountability, and on the profound impact that unsolved crime has, not just on investigators, but on the families and communities forever changed by violence they did not cause and could not prevent. The families of the victims have aged. Some may be deceased themselves. The communities they came from have changed. The city of Melbourne has grown and evolved. Australia itself has undergone enormous social change. Yet the questions remain. Did police have the right suspect? Was the evidence sufficient? Was there anything that could have been done differently that might have resulted in a different outcome? Investigators who worked the case have mostly retired. Some may be deceased. The files remain, stored in police archives, perhaps digitized now, accessible in new ways that would have been unimaginable in 1963. But the information in the files is the same information that was there 50 years ago. The evidence has not become more probative with age. The witnesses who are deceased cannot be re-interviewed. The suspect is gone, beyond reach, beyond accountability. Yet there remains in this case something that speaks to the human need for justice, for answers, for resolution. We want to know what happened. We want the guilty to be punished. We want closure for victims and their families. When we encounter cases like this one, where investigations suggest strongly that a particular person was guilty, but where legal proof sufficient for conviction could not be established, we are confronted with the gap between suspicion and proof, between what we believe and what the law requires. The case of the 4 children found dead in 1963 in the Melbourne suburbs is a tragedy in multiple dimensions. It is a tragedy of lives cut short, of families devastated by loss, of a community forever changed by violence. It is a tragedy of a justice system that could not reach its conclusion, that was thwarted by the death of the suspect. It is a tragedy of questions unanswered, of truths never officially acknowledged, of closure that never came. The children are gone. The suspect is dead. The case is cold. The truth, whatever justice it might have served, remains buried with them both. And across the decades, in Melbourne, in Dandenong, in the community where this tragedy unfolded, there remain families and investigators and community members who carry with them the memory of what happened, the knowledge of who they believe was responsible, and the pain of knowing that official justice, the kind that comes through trial and conviction, will never be served. This is the story of Melbourne's darkest autumn. This is the story of 4 children who should have grown up, fallen in love, had families of their own, lived long and meaningful lives. This is the story of a killer whom police believe they knew, but could never prove guilty in a court of law. This is the story of questions that demand answers that will never come. This is the story of justice deferred, delayed, and ultimately denied by the simple fact of death, the death of a suspect, the death of witnesses, the death of opportunities that passed and could not be recovered. The truth died with him. The victims remain forever young. The families remain forever grieving, and the community of Dandenong, the Melbourne suburbs, carries forward with the knowledge that something terrible happened there, something that was never fully resolved, something that changed what it meant to be a child in a place that once seemed safe.